But any sort of way of raising up the level of awareness can produce it. So I was reading all this stuff, and I had this book on the 14 serotonin receptors. I'm going, okay, well, which ones? I wanted to know which ones. And so I emailed Rick Strassman, and the guy must live on his computer, because I got an email straight back. I said, which ones? And he told me. I thought, oh, cool. And I think there was 4. But the one that was interesting was the number 4, or they call it the 5-HT4 receptor, because then I read up about each one. And the one that stood out was the 5-HT4 receptor, because it's very prevalent in the intralaminar nuclei of the thalamus, and I'll explain the significance of that, but also in the hippocampus and basal ganglia. But another interesting point about the 5-HT4 receptor, it actually, once the serotonin locks into it, it actually activates the cell a lot longer time than all the others. And that's interesting. So I think it's involved in the hippocampus because the hippocampus is very plastic, and it's involved with the plasticity of the hippocampus, which is involved, of course, in memory processes. There's also another glutamate receptor that does that in the hippocampus as well. I can't remember which one it is off the top of my head, but anyway. So it's a 5-HT4 receptor. That's the brain. We have the next picture. Keep going. Okay, so here's a picture of the thalamus. And we saw Charles was talking about the thalamus, and I'll talk about the reticular nucleus too, because I've got my own 2 bob to say about it. But anyway, here, this area here is the internal medullary lamina, and these are all your thalamic nuclei. And down in here, you can see the intralaminar nuclei of the thalamus. Now, what's interesting, there was once this case of a woman, she just went into a coma, never came out of it. And so they did an autopsy after she died, and what they found was that she had a bilateral stroke in her intralaminar nucleus of the thalamus. And which means, so in some circles in neurology, they'll say, well, that's where consciousness exists in the brain. And so that was interesting when Rick Strassman emailed me and told me, the receptors. So I went and looked them up, and I was reading all this, and I honed straight into the 5-HT4 receptor. So I emailed him back, and I said, did you know there was a lot of 5-HT4 receptors in the intralaminar nucleus of the thalamus, and that's where some people say consciousness exists in the brain? And he emails me back, he says, that's interesting, but do you know it's an illegal drug? I didn't have the heart to tell him. All I wanted to do was format it, and I didn't want to take it. But anyway, well, after all, that's what we do. But anyway, and so this was great. And I put all this, I think, wow, because, they're saying it, the hallucinogenic drugs, they take you up to a higher level of consciousness, thank you, and blah, blah, blah. And so then I thought, then I went overseas, and I went to Steve's place, and I was telling him about it, and he's going, great, do it on me. I was okay. And so I did it, and he went, and so I did his 5-HT4 receptor and his intralaminar nuclei of the thalamus, and he went off into a state, and he came out and he says, well, that was a cool pre-samadhi. And he said, well, what about samadhi? And I go, oh. And so I started thinking, so that means that the 5-HT4 receptor is not going to take you to the full place. And I started thinking, well, it's got to be the thalamus, and the first thing that came to my mind, well, in deep sleep, when you've got the so-called slow wave sleep, which shuts down the cortex, because the cortex has got to be shut down, and it's shut down by the reticular nucleus of the thalamus, shutting down the thalamus, and once the cortex loses its thalamic input, it shuts down. And so I thought, well, it's got to be the reticular nucleus of the thalamus, and the reticular nucleus of the thalamus has GABA as a neurotransmitter, which is inhibitory, so it turns off. So I said it's got to be GABA in the reticular nucleus of the thalamus. So I did it all on him, and he went into samadhi. And so that was interesting. And so it was interesting, so I started thinking about GABA, because normally what happens, you can have the next slide. Let's see if I've got it. Yeah, next one, that's just showing you a brain cut. Okay, so normally what happens, so if this is any given thalamic nucleus, like you saw there was lots of thalamic nuclei, and you've got like streams of data coming through, it's like masses of data, you know, it could be like 1,000 neurons or more. So that's a lot of information coming through. And so you imagine if you had like 1,000-lane highway trying to merge with another 1,000-lane highway, you would kind of get a bit of, be difficult to like, you know, try and find a spot to fit in. And so what happens, you know, as this information is streaming through, is the reticular nucleus of the thalamus sends inhibitory information, and normally what it does is it just slows down or it affects the timing of the information flow. And so what this does, and that's why I say, well, can you imagine if you had like 50 Italians trying to get through that door up there? You know, there'll be a lot of bumping and shoving and mamma mias and everything. And that's glutamate. So I say, well, glutamate's the Italian neurotransmitter, but what the GABA does is makes it nice and ordered, comes in like this. And so that's why I always call it the Swiss neurotransmitter, because if you've ever been to Switzerland, it's all straight. But when I was telling another friend of mine, Alfred, in Germany, and he's done a lot of work with neurotransmitters, and I was telling him about this thing I did on Steve, and he says, yes, it's the Buddha transmitter. I go, what? He says, GABA is the Buddha transmitter. And because he did this work on neurotransmitters, and he had like all the homeopathics of each transmitter, and he would take them and he would just say what the experience, he would start writing down his experiences, and that was a lot of the information that went into his work. And he said when he took GABA, he felt like he went into a Buddha state. It's interesting, isn't it? Have we got another one? Okay, that's format for the dinosaur. Anyway, so when you're looking at all that, that gives you like a physiological basis for consciousness and how it is expressed, or our level of awareness through the thalamus, and also how, you know, cells possibly can communicate through their DNA. And when last time I was through there just like 2 weeks ago, and I was telling him about all this stuff and Kundalini, so he says, great, do it on me. Great. So I did. You know, I went to the reticular nucleus of the thalamus, then into the cell DNA, then Ida and Pingala, and sure enough, he went bang straight into samadhi. So that was an interesting experiment, and I've been very fortunate over the years to be able to work with him because it gives you the ability to understand, or gives me the ability to actually try it out and have someone who has that experience tell me what it's doing, you know. So it's kind of confirmed in a way what I've been doing. But anyway, that's about it for me. I've had the 5-minute bell. So now just a couple of words from my sponsors. There's Anne and Osha are there with flyers for my workshop on the East Coast next year. I mean later this year, November, and also teaching some courses next year. If anyone's interested, you can see Anne McFerrin. Okay, so that's it.